Welcome to Contemplify, where we seek to kindle the examined life for contemplatives in the world. I'm your host, Paul Swanson. Today, I welcome Sister Laura Swan, a Benedictine sister, spiritual director, author, teacher, and archivist. In our conversation, we talk about her book, The Wisdom of the Beguines, the forgotten story of a medieval women's movement. If you've been following Contemplify, you know I am fascinated by the Beguine movement, as I think it is an incredibly instructive movement for our times. Sister Laura brings a contagious passion and a catalog of wisdom to the Beguines that I hope seeps into your soul. Can't wait for you to hear more about the Beguine movement. As always, you can visit contemplify.com for the show notes on this episode. You can learn more about Sister Laura on her YouTube page, at Benedictine Laura Swan on YouTube. Now join me in raising a glass to my guest today, Sister Laura Swan. Sister Laura Swan, I'm so happy to be in your company today, even if it's digitally. To kind of set the scene for all those listening, can you just share where are you in the world right now? Where are we finding you today?
Well, I live in a Benedictine monastery about an hour south of Seattle. Most people haven't heard of Lacey, Olympia, even though we're the state capital. We are a foundation from St. Benedict, St. John's in central Minnesota. Benedictines have a genealogy that goes all the way back, really for women, to about 700 Common Era. And so we've been out here in the Northwest about 135 years, although most people have never heard of us. I guess the littleness of Benedict.
I love it. You're living it out. And I don't have it. Was just in Collegeville.
Oh, yeah.
Last spring, I have my mug from there that I typically drink coffee out of, that I would have raised to that connection. When did you join the community?
I began the process in 1989. It's a 5 to 6 year process, depending on your own journey, till final, or what we call perpetual monastic profession. So I made initial profession in 93 and final profession in 96. And then my baptism by fire is 2 years later in 98. I found myself elected prioress of my community, which is very unusual. So I jokingly call it my third novitiate. My second round of graduate school was definitely my second novitiate. And then there was the official one.
Wow, no rest for the weary.
That's right.
Sister Laura, as we were talking beforehand, the goal of this podcast is really just to kindle the examined life for contemplatives in the world. And I'm curious, knowing from your own Benedictine stream and all that you have done and lived and studied in your life, when you hear that word contemplative, how does that moniker relate to you and your work, if you think it does at all?
Oh, it most certainly does. I will back up by saying that as a young child, nature spoke to me of God, and my siblings and I, out the door and down to a swamp down below our house, where all the other neighborhood kids were out there, and we were playing, but I would go wandering off alone and just kind of gazing at trees and watching the birds. And so nature has always spoken deeply to me of God's presence in the world. And I refer to creation as God's cathedral, not the ones we build, although we've built some lovely ones over human history. Really, in the end, it's nature. And I think that's why Pope Francis, who is much loved beyond Catholic circles for his constant haranguing on how we have to stop destroying the environment, he certainly saw and experienced what a destroyed environment did to his people when he was working in Argentina. And we're deaf ears for too many people. But I think I've always lived with a contemplative stance, a gift of my parents of finding and experiencing the divine through artwork, through plays, through music. My father was really into music. They were down to the Preservation Hall in New Orleans. We weren't rich, but they always managed to find their way down there at least once a year to sit and listen to the jazz. But for them, it really was touching into the divine. That, and I grew up with a lot of people coming to visit my father because of the field he was in from different cultures around the world. So I was growing up in the midst of people whose first language was Chinese or Italian or German, or with enough English that everybody could communicate, and hearing their stories and seeing how similar and different, yet different, good, different, honoring different kinds of cultures was just very rich for me. So it was a natural fit for me when I landed in the monastery. I was not one of those stunning stories that, woke up one day with this divine intervention that says, oh my God, you're now going to go off and become a nun. I claim that I slid through the back door and I was one of the least worthy of God's choices for landing here, but it was a natural fit because we talk in the Benedictine world about living from a contemplative stance. It is something that we encourage people who hang out with us to be cultivating. And a contemplative stance for us is being fully in the world, but with enough disconnect to observe how the Holy Spirit might be moving in the midst of situations in people's lives, our corporate life, our individual life, but also seeing what's going on in the world. And can we hear the prophetic voices? This is a day and age where the contemplative, I believe, is deeply tied in with works of social justice, and that there is no going off to some mountaintop and, I'm using funny stereotypes, but sitting around ooming all day long and just, me and the universe. I really don't believe the divine is calling us to that kind of contemplative. It's a contemplative that, as Pope Francis says, you smell like the sheep. You get your hands dirty. You're rubbing shoulders with people you wouldn't rub shoulders with. Yet there's enough of a space between you and the people you are journeying with, accompanying, living with, where you can hear and sense the Spirit moving in a particular situation, and then have the courage to speak truth to power. And oftentimes this is not like the big P power, but the situations that we've been placed in, however we've been called to speak to what we see as an injustice. Some of the great minds say, if you can't see it, you can't name it. And I think in the last 20 years, maybe a bit more, we're opening up our eyes a bit more to the fact that white folk have been able to live with white privilege, meaning I don't have to know what the experience of people of color or recent immigrants or different language groups, what their experience is. I don't have to know this because I have that privilege of being totally in my own enclave. And I think God really is trying to push all of us out of our enclaves into the mess of living and journeying with one another, because something new is emerging and we just aren't there yet. And I've been privileged to teach part-time our university down the road, St. Martin's University, that is now majority minority. And some of my students have been minorities living within this country, and some are from the Pacific Islands or what used to be China before COVID hit. But very enriching experience journeying with them.
Wow, what a robust answer. We started with nature and God's cathedral and music, and then you brought it into your Benedictine tradition and landed with the unmitigated way of how contemplation is not separate from social justice. And I could not agree more, just the way that you're bringing in some of the themes that embody my own life and being. So it's fun to hear you articulate that in that specific way. Do you have a practice that you would call a contemplative practice that is a part of your daily rhythm that supports this contemplative stance in the world?
Certainly, as Benedictines, we gather 3 times a day for prayer. And I consider that like a framework or an anchor to the rest of our day. I have a practice of Lectio Divina, but for us, in my house particularly, it is not necessarily just sacred texts. It's not just the Tanakh, Old Testament, New Testament, but it can be poetry. It could be the writing of these prophets. It can be going out in nature. That's the museums and walking in nature that is a contemplative practice, and yet it's also Lectio Divina. It can be, if you choose with an intentionality to allow yourself to interact with creation or with, I've often joked that when I do go to an art museum, although I have particular attractions, especially the Impressionists, I make myself go to some of this postmodern sections, what I consider pretty ugly, and I make myself choose one ugly picture, and then I sit there and gaze at that ugly picture to figure out what it's speaking to my heart, even though I find it disturbing. What is the disturbing about? And it's not an intellectual process more than a heart formation process. We certainly have practices of sitting together in silence. We carve out time in our own life. So for me, my bedroom works just fine. I'm in my office and this is where I work. So it would not be particularly contemplative down here, although I can't say it doesn't happen. But my bedroom is set up in such a way where I have nature kind of coming in. I have full wall windows in my bedroom and can sit there and gaze out at nature, or just, it's quieter there. And I'm not attracted or drawn or obligated to take on work, which can always be a distraction. Trust me, people who live in monasteries can easily become workaholics. It's not an escape from that part of ourselves. If anything, you confront yourself more when you come into a monastery than when I was living. I lived alone for some years, owned a house, lived by myself. In some ways, I joke that I was probably more contemplative then than I am here, because now I have the demands of our public sisters in our community who are getting frail, just the work of the monastery that in some ways it's less contemplative, but it's not. It's just a different kind.
Yeah. I love the nuancing you're talking about there, because I think sometimes the idealization or the romanticization of what a contemplative life looks like is just that. It's a figment of our imaginations, where the gristy reality of contemplative, whether you're behind monastic walls or you're living out in the world, there's always challenges.
And the reality is we don't have walls here. We intentionally built our building, which is about 35 years old, with as many windows as possible. And so as I'm looking at you, I'm also looking out. Actually, I have the cemetery in front of me, but we have the max number of windows that building code would allow us to bring nature in. But there can be a metaphorical wall.
Yeah. Well, I love that. I mean, that is stating values right there about the significance of that. Sister Laura, another way for folks to get to know you, I'm excited to see where this answer might go. But if someone were going to teach a class on the formation of Sister Laura Swan, what would be the 3 mandatory readings or works that formed you that would definitely be on that syllabus?
Interesting question. My first book, which is called The Forgotten Desert Mothers, is the result of the sister teaching monastic history to me, which begins in the desert, getting frustrated with me because without thinking, I kept asking, well, where are the women? Where are the women? Where are the women? Because it starts in the desert, because Benedict is very much out of the desert tradition. And she got frustrated with me and told me one day, go out and find them yourself. And so I literally began a pursuit of these women, which is probably my 4th division, hunting up and down, footnotes, endnotes, anywhere to find these women. And I just had a file growing of stories of women in the desert. And back in those days, we're talking 92, 93, there wasn't much interest in desert ascetics, let alone women. And I was speaking to a group of Episcopalian women on Celtic spirituality, and I happened to mention that when they felt the desert was getting too crowded, they went to the west of Ireland, which they considered the ends of the earth. And a woman came up to me afterwards and she said, where did you find the women? And I said, well, I just got this file that every time I find them, I drop papers into it. She looked at me. I have no idea who she is. She said, you are going to write a book. She turned around and walked off. I knew she was absolutely right, and I had no idea what in the hell I was doing, because I had no idea how you go about writing a book. And it turned into The Desert Mothers, which is now garnered a lot of interest. It's been published in like 11 languages. I mean, I thought it would have a 2-year shelf life and then just die. It turns out that's not the case. It hit a nerve. And a Coptic scholar who has since become my great defender, but although we've never managed to meet, Tim Vivian, he called me one day and he said, you know, we know about all these desert mothers. We just didn't think anyone was interested. And I wanted to reach through the telephone and wring his neck. And because I did all this hard work, only to find out it was common knowledge, but he meant amongst the few scholars of that particular era. A lot of work has been done since, but he's my great defender whenever some idiot comes along and says, well, there's just this overemphasis on women. They didn't make much of a contribution. Then let's go back and talk about the men. It's like, oh, honey, you have no idea what you're talking about. And of course, we don't have, for men or women, all the information we would like to have. Probably the next factor, I am my mother's daughter, so it's really not all my fault. And really some of my great aunts as well. It's all their fault. But I had the same frustration going through monastic history. And now I teach monastic history to the women joining my monastery. And I'm bloody determined to find as much on the women as possible, keeping some of the colorful guys, because there are some great colorful guys in Benedictine history. But so I think it's going to be my last project. I'm 70. I'm giving myself 10 more years, but I am writing a history of Benedictine women from the time of Benedict to about 1850, when we start spreading all over the world. And those histories tend to get written. They may not be easy to find, but they are out there and you can find them. But there's nothing. I mean, it's again like the Desert Mothers. There's a footnote here. There's a paragraph here. There might be a chapter there. I feel like writing a campaign against women scholars who are publishing over and over again on guys and saying, so when are you going to stop and start paying attention in your specific field and language group on the monastic women? And I mean those who follow the rule of Benedict. Because some scholars mush everybody together as one kind of expression of religious life. And as a footnote, in Orthodoxy, Greek, Russian, Coptic Orthodoxy, the founder of monasticism for them is not Basil. That's the kid brother of Macrina. She is the founder of Orthodox monasticism. And Orthodox scholars now agree that Basil was simply writing down what he learned from his bossy older sister, because he came to Christianity quite late. He was 35. She'd already been living the life for 15, 20 years before she finally convinced him and his squirty brother Gregory to finally get serious about the monastic life. So I guess you could say Feisty Women is the course of studies of Sister Laura. As I said, it's all my mother's fault. You know, I'm totally helpless. I have to do what I have to do.
Well, she raised you right. I'm loving this, and it's funny. I was just having that conversation with someone yesterday about, I can never pronounce her name. How do you pronounce Basil's sister's name again?
Oh, Macrina.
Macrina, and how she was really the highest order intellect embodiment of what her brothers were.
Absolutely.
Generously sharing with the world, but she did not get the credit that she deserves.
No.
So I'm glad that continues to unfold.
It was of a culture. I mean, it was a patriarchal culture, but oftentimes men put their name to things that were really written by women. And it was not really about, today we would call it plagiarism or something like that. It was just the cultural expectation of the day. But it was a patriarchal culture.
Mm-hmm. Well, I might have first discovered your name when it came to the Desert Mothers. I will say that your name has been tattooed on my heart with this book, The Wisdom of the Beguines, The Forgotten Story of a Medieval Women's Movement. I find the Beguines to be endlessly fascinating. And have really struck a chord of inspiration for me, because I do think that there's a scaffolding of a radical movement that incorporates the totality of the flair and fragrance of Christ and how they went and served and lived in the world. How would you describe the Beguine movement to somebody who had never heard it before? How would you set them up to kind of see the spark of inspiration and the trajectory it took?
The word Beguine originally meant a two-faced liar or a mumbler, but very quickly became a compliment. And the movement erupted all over Europe about the same time, around 1200, 1180, 1200. And it was an expression and is an expression of the apostolic Vita Apostolica, which is the life of the apostles. Jesus was supposed to return in the year 1000, and he apparently forgot. And so people in the marketplace, they say reform happens from the bottom up, and that is true. The lowest strata of society were talking to each other about why didn't Jesus return? Well, it's because we're so corrupt. We've got a church that's so corrupt. Our politicians are so corrupt that we've got to clean up our act so that we are worthy of Jesus's return. And that begins a movement of like a reform in monastic life. This is when Francis of Assisi comes along, when the Franciscans and Dominic and Catherine of Siena, another great doctor of the church. She should be read by many, many people because she took on the corruption of her day. But the Beguines were part of that stream. And it was women who felt called to serve the gospel in particular ways that meant they didn't want to join a monastery where they might be under a bit more control. Although Benedictine abbesses were great supporters of the Beguines and even came to their defense before bishops or princes or whomever else to defend the women, they felt called to serve, and therefore they knew they needed to be self-supporting. So it wasn't that they were forbidden to ever marry. They just simply opted against marriage, or what was considered acceptable in their day. As husbands were going off on the Crusades or whatever else, a woman could join a religious movement, and that would be considered an acceptable form of divorce. So these were women who came together all at once across Europe, starting small, and it grew, where they wanted to support themselves and their ministries. And their ministries were, this is going to sound familiar, they were setting up schools to educate both children and adults. This was a time when the farms were drying up, partly because of weather, partly because of economics, and girls were coming in off the farms and they were in danger of human trafficking. And these women would gather them up and bring them to their home and start training them in a skill to support themselves, educate them. They set up hospitals. Now, don't think high-tech hospitals of today, but they practiced the medicine they knew of their day. Hildegard of Bingen, the great abbess who wrote at least one major treatise on herbs and health benefits for processes to help people. But they also called them hospices, where sometimes people were brought there in the last leg of life to be taken care of until they died. Think of Mother Teresa of Calcutta. That wasn't their primary work, but it was part of the work. So how did they support themselves? Well, these women, it would be northern France, western Germany, present-day Belgium and Holland. They called that the Low Countries. They imported sheep's wool from England. They spun it, carded it, wove it, turned it into fancy clothes for rich women, or they sold bolts of cloth back across to England. They underpriced the guilds, which made the guilds very angry because they thought they had a monopoly, but the women outsmarted them. Their quality of fabric was much better than the guild. They made very good money at that. In northern Italy, it was linen spinning. In Paris and parts of Germany, it was silk making. So it was kind of all this fabric-y kinds of business, either creating just the raw fabric or creating the capes and dresses. They were courtiers to the rich women. They didn't take donations. They did not go around begging. That was part of how they commanded respect, is they were totally self-sufficient. Some of them became great financiers, writing letters of credit and exchanging money, down shoulder to shoulder with the guys and these places where you could go to get money exchange, or with your letter credit, get the money you need. And they made very good money off of that. Of course, it also helped with dealing with all of the money they earned from the woolens. In northern countries and in Italy, not so much evidence in Spain, they bought a house, and 3 or 4 or 5 women would live there. And as they made money, they bought the house next door across the street. and have a cluster of houses. They always had a room or two for widows or women. It was older women whose children could either feed their own kids or mom, and usually mom lost out. And so the Beguines would always have one or two or three rooms dedicated for these older women who needed care and support but had no family that could take care of them. But they're probably most famous for their Beguinages, or in the Flemish Beguinehof. And you can visit these in Diest, Louvain, Ghent, Bruges. You can actually stay in some of these. In Bruges, the old Beguinage there is now occupied by some Benedictine women who, two of them dress up as Beguines, and they're a living museum, but they're also a Benedictine monastery, and you can stay in their guest house. And what they would do is they would buy property and they would build what you and I would call townhouses. In Northern Europe, in Italy too, the houses were narrow and tall because land was precious. And so you built up if you needed more space. And so they built these townhouses around the edge of the property. And this would be 30 acres, oftentimes a large piece of property, always alongside of canal, because a canal was the highway of their day, and not roads, especially in the northern countries. And that would effectively create a wall around the town. And so Beguinage means a city within a city. And there would be a couple of gates that would open up to the public. If you're coming into town for the market day, you could get there before the gates close, and you can sleep in the large expanse of grass and land. Your sheep could be safe. You would be safe. Nobody'd rob you. Next day, you can go into the marketplace and sell your goods and go home. So they were kind of a quasi-hotel, but they had schools there. They had a hospital there. They had the beer making. They had the beehives. They were relatively self-sufficient in case there was ever trouble, but they always paid taxes. They refused the church's offer to make them official church property. And the value of that is that if ever a bishop or a cardinal went after them for heresy, the town aldermen defended those women because they wanted the tax base. So they were very politically astute and wise. And no, the last Beguine has not died out. I know in 96 or 98, there were news articles in the New York Times and in European newspapers about, I don't remember her name, but so-and-so, the last Beguine died. No. I don't know where they just didn't check into it. About a year and a half ago, I was in Germany, Essen, Germany, for a conference of Beguines. And a couple of guys came up and self-identified as beggars, but beggars never really took off. That was the men. And they became, the Alexian brothers considered themselves the sons of the beggars. And because healthcare is what Alexian brothers were very much into. But the woman who organized it said, there's at least 600 Beguines in Germany alone. I met Beguines from Italy, Switzerland, France, and Ireland. I know there's a small community of Beguines outside of Dublin. And they have their ministry and their work that they do. And so it has not died out. It got slim sometimes based on wars and the French Revolution and stuff like that. But the Holy Spirit simply cannot be crushed. If she gets suppressed in one area, she's going to pop up in another area, and that's what happens.
Yes, amen to that. You've told such a story that shows the savviness, the business acumen, the generosity of spirit, the hospitality. There's so many different terrains that we could explore in conversation with the Beguines. One thing that I would love to know from your perspective is, how do they differ from a monastic community? Because it's my understanding that they also would create their own rule of life. Would that be distinct to each community, or was there a shared commonality about how they approached a communal rule of life?
Young scholars are hunting down as many examples of Beguine rules as they can find to answer that question. First of all, women who followed the rule of Benedict renounced all their own personal property. They might have a communal business as a monastery, but we today do not have our own personal property. Whereas the Beguines were free to marry, they could leave to marry if marriage then was really not about true love. So sometimes Beguines left to marry to protect family property, family estates, the welfare of their children if they became a Beguine after their children grew up. So that, they had the freedom to leave, whereas Benedictines were expected to be there for life and wanted to be. Benedictines lived a more strict observance in terms of simplicity, poverty, than Beguines were ever, did not have to. It's an individual choice. They also had a lot more mobility. They could go out on preaching tours. They were known as the funeral specialists, the Beguines were. It was a very real fear in medieval ages of dying without the last rites, of not getting buried in consecrated ground. They honestly believed that if either of those failed to happen, they might spend eternity in hell. I mean, that's kind of a sad way of thinking, and the Beguines tried to correct it, but they did agree to, and you didn't have to be a wealthy person. If you just came and asked them, they would agree to come when you're in the process of dying, and they would sit with you and chant the psalms for the dying and for the dead, and they'd wash your body afterwards, with the family. There's family there. And journey with your body to consecrated ground, guaranteeing that this would happen. Benedictines couldn't do that. They might, however, as Hildegard of Bingen did, allow you to come and be buried on abbatial grounds. She got into big trouble with Rome because she heard the last confession and gave the last rites to a guy who apparently was considered a heretic or somehow got in trouble with the church, and he was excommunicated. And she heard his last confession. She gave him last rites, and she buried him in her cemetery. And the church came demanding to dig up his body and throw him into, I don't know, wherever, the garbage dump. So the sisters went out and they removed all the headstones and kind of smoothed over the ground. And so when the officials arrived, they couldn't tell who was where. It's like, yeah, that would be a Benedictine way of revolting. But the Beguines had a lot more mobility. They could go out on preaching tours, start up new Beguinage communities where there was a need. Some Beguines left their Beguinage community to go start a new community amongst lepers. And so they literally lived with the lepers. They built little houses. They built a chapel, or, supported themselves, but journeyed with the lepers, giving them a sense of dignity and worth and all that sort of thing.
That's incredible. As you're saying that some of these younger scholars are finding different rules of life among them.
Yeah.
And each is kind of unique to their own community.
There would be both a uniqueness and commonness, I would think.
Okay.
Even Benedictines do that today. We come home from meetings and say, this is how they do this office, or this is how this new psalm, this new canticle that they found. We chant more than just out of the Bible. We've got the rule. We've got the writings of women. We chant. I found Karl Rahner at a monastery, and I made copies and brought it home and transcribed it for us. And now we chant some of his gorgeous writings for one of the feast days that we honor. We're typing good ideas all the time, and I'm sure the Beguines did the exact same thing. That's the early desert ascetics, same thing. How are we going to handle common funds? How are we going to handle the poor who come to the door?
Mm-hmm.
How are we going to handle guests? What do we do with the children? When are we going to pray? How will we preserve our prayer times from disruption? Just very practical things.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's one thing I appreciate about the rule, the different interpretations, is that specificity about hospitality, or even how much wine you can drink. Or it's great that there's these concrete things to help build this sense of commonality.
Yeah.
I would love to hear your sense of the Beguines' approach to spirituality and how it differed or was similar to other contemporary movements of that time.
Interesting question, and a very good one. Beguines, of course, grew up in the church, and so they've read the theologians, they've read the scholars. They actually learned Hebrew and Greek, not all of them, but some, and they translated the Hebrew and the Greek into the local vernacular so that they could read from the text in a language that the people could understand and preach from that. Partly they were of the stream of a well-educated or well-read schools of theology, but they also were very creative. They came down in an era when the human body was not valued. This is the age of the Crusades. It didn't matter how many died. It didn't matter that the poor died. It didn't matter how many children died before their fifth birthday. And the Beguines said no. And the way they preached this and over and against this denigration of the value of human life was actually through what Catholics call the real presence in the Eucharist. If you've been to a Catholic Mass, you know, they're up at the altar and there's a series of Eucharistic prayers that are prayed. And then there's an elevation. There's a point when the priest raises up the cup and the bread. In Middle Ages would have been just the bread, but the consecrated host. And the Beguines adamantly instructed the priest to hold that up there for 2, 3, 5, 7 minutes. They wanted everyone in the church to see that. Now, their point was, this is the real presence of Christ in this consecrated bread. And as Jesus was fully human and is sacred, you are fully human and sacred. And so it was their way of kind of nonviolently resisting denigration of the human body. And so in many ways, Beguines influenced the thinking in the church about whether it was consubstantiation, which is more the Lutheran stance, still very close to Catholics, or transubstantiation, where it becomes literally the body and blood. The Beguines came down on, it's the real body and blood, and it was connected to the fact that human life was sacred. That, and they had a number of visions where they saw that, you know, purgatory was a hot issue. You know, Dante Alighieri's great trilogy. Yeah, he's basically the one who came up with the fires of hell and the levels of purgatory. And it's great, fiery, wonderful. So everyone should read Dante's. I mean, for God's sake, he ended up having to hit the road and disappear because the authorities were after him because he skewered popes and bishops and cardinals and princes. And I mean, he really got into, and to suggest that courtesans and prostitutes might be up in the upper reaches of heaven. They were usually the more generous with the poor than any duke or king or cardinal ever was in those days. They saw visions of purgatory in the way that their hearers could understand. Today, if somebody talked like them, we might want to have a come to Jesus conversation with them about certain things. But this was of their era, and they get to be of their era, where they would pray people through purgatory to the full presence of God. But they said it was in the worship, the acknowledgement of Jesus and the crucified Christ in the elevation of the host there that people went through the stages of purgatory to being in the full presence of God. They were adamant supporters that, I mean, they were still of their era, but that women were fairly capable of an education, of skills, of having freedom to marry or not marry. Of course, that didn't always go over well if you were in the upper reaches of society where marriages were about politics and preserving family wealth and, you know, that sort of thing. They apparently had huge influence on artwork. Scholars are studying pietas that come out of the north, and they're quite certain that these were made for Beguines at the instruction of Beguines. Great in copying and illuminating manuscripts. Of course, this was before the printing press. Creating their own prayer books, always the 150 psalms and certain prayers. But Beguines oftentimes requested a book be made for this, copied for them, including some of their poetry, their favorite hymns. Weirdly enough, the Farmer's Almanac, the medieval version of that, was oftentimes in the back of their prayer book. Like, what's that all about? Who knows? But they're found in some of the books that they've been able to identify as belonging to Beguines.
That's fascinating. I feel like anytime I read a book about the Beguines or have a conversation, there's a new area of exploration. And I know for me, I was introduced to the Beguines through the back door, through Meister Eckhart. And can you speak a little bit about that relationship? What was the relationship between Meister Eckhart and the Beguines?
The Beguines oftentimes had very close relationships with different Dominicans, some of whom got into trouble for being great defenders of the Beguines. Part of it was the intellectual sparring back and forth in the very best sense of the word. Dominicans who would take the women seriously and sit in conversation with groups of Beguines over theological issues. But the Beguines also understood Meister Eckhart because of his visions, his erotic poetry, of which Beguines also composed erotic poetry. It was in the form of the troubadours. In fact, some women were troubadours, and probably Hadwick, who was a Beguine, was also considered a troubadour, considered the finest crafter of poetry of that era. I'm not into poetry, but I trust the people who are into it who say that, yeah, she's actually considered one of the best. But yeah, he had great respect for these women, both because of their intellect, because of their independence in ministry, but also because of their visions and the fact that they understood him. In fact, many Dominican communities of women now acknowledge their original founders were Beguines, who started calling themselves Dominican because of their Dominican chaplain, and were not accepted formally as Dominicans for many years, but they claimed the title anyway.
I love that. I love that. Those origin stories and like the shared roots of that. It's funny that you say you're not a fan of poetry, because Hadwick is she's become near and dear to me, and her poems, I think, I find so evocative of connection to the divine and steeping in love in the desert. Of kind of the most well-known Beguines, is there one that you feel a specific kinship or affinity to that has either spiritually been a kindred spirit, or has either propelled you in new directions of possibility as you've thought about your own spiritual path?
You know, people aren't aware of this, but Catherine of Siena began as a Beguine. Nowadays, they call her a Dominican tertiary, but tertiary doesn't come in until much later in history. She began as a mantellate. That's what Beguines in Siena were known as. That was their local term for a Beguine. And it was a reference to a large black shawl they wore around their shoulders when they went out and about. She was a Beguine. She went out on preaching tours. She went to, as an unknown young woman, she went to southern France to condemn the Pope, who was sitting in France under the control of the French king, to get back to Rome and start the reform of the church. She was down in Rome, again, going after the popes, to start reforming the church and take on corrupt priests and bishops. I resonate a lot with Catherine of Siena because of that prophetic speaking ministry. And no, she was not illiterate. I know that's another pious story they dump on her. She was probably just moderately literate until she started having visions and needed to write them down. And yes, she had they always called him a spiritual director, but it was more of a secretary that she could bounce ideas off of. And he would probably have scripted the final version of her letters and of her visions. But she became highly literate, just like many other Beguines over the course of her life. But primarily it was her preaching tour, her calling, her passion for justice, and the belief that a more honest church structure could bring in the social justice. Of course, they said charity in those days. Social justice is a more recent terminology that we use. My parents were very much into social justice, but they called it charity, which was not just about handing out a bit of money. They put skin in the game big time, but it's just the way they talked about it. So I think it's Catherine of Siena that I most relate to, and I cringe every time I hear even a modern day writer, refer to her as a Dominican tertiary. It's like, no, yeah, they prayed at the Dominican church. If you've ever been to Siena, there's the Dominican church, which is not the huge basilica. Everybody who goes to Siena must see the gorgeous floors and walls in that not completed church. But the Dominican church sits on a precipice, and you take a winding road down, and her family's home is almost literally underneath the Dominican church. And so it's logical that she and her family would have gone to Mass at that Dominican church, and that the women who were forming Beguine communities, and they were not so much living in communities. She did have, in the end, probably 6 or 8 women who lived with her in her later years, but they were more out of their home, but their own home, but prayed together and shared ministries together around town. They were not Dominican tertiaries. That is a term that comes later, when the Franciscans and the Dominicans of the male persuasion were vying for who was more important out of that movement. It's like, well, we've got Catherine and this so-and-so and so-and-so, but we've got so... And all of a sudden, these women they wanted nothing to do with, all of a sudden are being called Franciscan tertiaries or Dominican tertiaries. It's like, oh, no. And of course, eventually, Dominican and Franciscan communities of women emerged, but that was after, and a century or two after Dominic and Francis, because they weren't wanted by the men.
Yeah. It's a tragedy that it was more of once popularity rose, they tried to get them to join your group, but that certainly is the ways of our in-groups and out-groups and how we build status.
Yeah.
I'm curious what your sense would be of looking at the Beguine movement as an architecture for a new kind of lay movement of contemplatives enriching through specific ministries of works of justice in the world. How do you see that as a potential or applicable in our world today? Do you think, because I see that in the Beguine movement, it seems like a map of sorts. How would you respond to that sense of, could what they have built be transposed to our times as a model for what it means to follow Christ in these ways, in these times?
They are. There are Beguine communities in Europe. I visited several of them.
Yeah.
What was the surprise for many of them when I spent time with them was they had the social justice piece, wanting to live in shared community, wanted to have shared ministries, community time together, support one another, because these were usually women and usually older women, but not all. What they didn't know is that there was a faith tradition behind it. There was a relationship with the divine, and I kept it simple to the point of each of us are born with a divine spark. And so how do you nurture and grow that divine spark within yourself and then within the life of your community? And that was kind of the question many of them went away with, needing to, in the best sense of the word, wrestle with, because they'd had the outer structures together, but only some of them had the inner structure there. It's slower here in the United States. Of course, we're fiercely independent, but I do see a movement of people wanting to form intentional community. And they're learning from both the Benedictine way and the Beguine way as to what works and what doesn't work. There are lay communities, usually living in shared neighborhoods, but with their own houses. I'm thinking of a few. They jokingly not jokingly, they seriously called themselves the new monasticism. And then they found out, oh, this is really old. But the venerables of the Benedictine tradition treated them with great respect, but said, hey, there's this thing called this tradition, this voice. It worked with them to help them support their structures. And these are surviving, not just surviving, but thriving quite well. There is the Community of Jesus out on Cape Cod. Yes, there's a monastery out there. They're Benedictine. They're married, widowed, single, divorced, vowed celibate, dating and looking for significant other. But they share a common life, and yet they have their own life. They're doing a nice mixture between the two. There is one community up in either Vermont or New Hampshire, I can't remember which one. People are yearning for human connection, and I think the stories of the Beguines give them great diversity about how that could come about. But these communities are only going to continue to exist even through one lifetime if there is a shared sense of social justice. I don't care what one thing you commit to, but they've got to commit to one thing that they will share in common that is outside of themselves, that makes this communal living more about than just us, but about giving in beyond ourselves. I do think the question of the internal spark, the contemplative life, needs to be addressed. I don't think it means we all join ABC Church. I think it's about this is how we're going to actually, for many of them, it's the morning and evening office. However you create that, whatever translation, whatever combination you put together. I know when one new monastic community formed in North Philadelphia, they contacted the local Baptist church, just a humble, simple, old church building, and got a key. And in the morning and the evening, they met for their office that they created, and then they all went off to work their ministries, whatever they did. But morning and evening anchored, and then usually a couple of times a week, shared communal meals, but kids played together and integrated into the community. Because these were mostly white folk who then moved into a predominantly brown and black neighborhood, and they all get along great, and they're addressing systemic poverty and things like that. I think some church communities are now looking at that model of how can we, as a church, be more like an intentional community. Again, not necessarily living together, but shared ministries outside of the church building and coming together for meals and prayers outside of the traditional Sunday service. I think I am seeing movements in these directions, but Beguines do offer a model, and it doesn't have to be a single-gendered model. The ones I met in Europe were single-gendered, but it doesn't have to be that way. It can be families who decide they are going to form some kind of community that is both handling their own finances, because it gets real ugly if we try to have a common pot, but also sharing in this life together and extending. There's a group up in the northern North St. Louis, which was apparently a traditionally Black neighborhood. And as the speaker was sharing his community story, one block would be middle class, working class Black folk, one block of grinding poverty, another block of, it was just kind of a little mishmash. And they chose to start buying the simple, humble homes. These are all people who went to graduate school together at one of the big schools at St. Louis, into this neighborhood of basically these abandoned houses, rundown houses. And he said, we were not known in the neighborhood as the white folk. We were known as the chicken folk because our wives kept chickens in the backyard. He said, they didn't look at skin pigmentation. What they thought was weird were all these chickens that they brought into the neighborhood. But there are so many opportunities, and I really think a call to human. Again, I'm not trying to push Catholic on anybody, Catholicism, but Pope Francis wrote a great encyclical on the importance of the human community. I think he even did a round 2 of it as well. Unfortunately, I'm of a certain generation, when the title first came in, the first thing we read was Tutti Frutti rather than Fratelli Tutti, which is the first 2 words in Latin, which is where the names come from of papal documents. But again, he's talking about the breakdown of human community and how this has got to stop or we are going to all die. And the importance of community. And community doesn't mean there isn't a space for the contemplative, because there must be.
Amen. That's such a beautiful invitation to explore the different variations of what it can look like to live in this kind of contemplative centered way without losing the unique vocational call to how you are serving the world, whether it be as a single person or a married person or working. There's such a multitude of ways that one can live and try to seek that kind of community. And I'm grateful to live in a time where that's possible. And I love hearing the different variations and the folks that you know and how you've seen that pop up, because I think it does take risk. It does take a leaning into our own sense of incarnational wonder about who we are and how we can be connected beyond just the little internal communal unit, but how do we also face outward and not have it just be about the sustaining of a community, but a community of communities that serves across borders and difference? Sister Laura, have you heard of the book Sun House before? It's a novel. It came out last year by an incredible novelist named David James Duncan.
Oh, I know. Yeah, I know David James Duncan. Yeah. He was a good friend of Brian Doyle, another great writer. Yeah.
That's right. Two great writers. And he just wrote a book. Duncan just wrote a book called Sun House. And the latter half of the book is about, he calls it an unintentional menagerie of folks who live together based on the model of the Beguines. And the Beguines are the inspiration for an alternative way of living under this time of climate collapse and the corporatization of everything. So I was just curious if you had read it before, because your comments on it would be really interesting, knowing your expertise and how you've steeped in this work. But if you ever get around to reading it, I would love to hear your thoughts.
Mm-hmm. He doesn't write short novels. You have to be definitely very committed to anything he's written.
Yeah, I want to say this one ended up almost 900 pages or something like that. So it's...
And then his buddy who didn't write 900-page novels, but he could write one sentence over 2 and 3 pages and it still worked. That's Brian Doyle.
Yeah, Brian Doyle could knock you out with the shortest piece. And there's still some of his pieces I still think about once a week. It pops into mind.
Yeah.
Sister Laura, you mentioned the book that you're working on, but I'd be curious as we round out our conversation, what else is calling your curiosity forward or your wonder? Where are you being drawn to as far as what you're contributing to the world, whether it's inside your own community or something that you're looking to share with a wider audience?
Besides Benedictine women, I have a novel that's coming out shortly called The Hannah Document.
Oh.
Which I was trying to figure out how to get women or how to get people interested in these early women. So it's a story of a Greek scholar, a young woman, a scholar of languages particularly, who goes and hunts for Deacon Olympius's letters. In reality, Deacon Olympius was a real woman. She was a close friend of John Chrysostom, who's considered one of the fathers of the church. His letters to her survived. There was very, very close friendship between the two, but her letters to him didn't survive. So I wrote them based on what I know of the history. It pushed a few edges. You have to for novels. And she slips onto Mount Athos, which is an all-male terrain, finds some of the letters, but stumbles into something extraordinary, and it is extraordinary, and had a blast creating it. And I start the novel with a statement: consider her last major discovery a piece of midrash. Please do not fundamentalize it or literalize it. Call your local bishop to have me beaten up or something like that. It's just for fun. But it's also about trying to show people what scholars do in trying to retrieve these old documents. You know from St. John's, digitizing all the endangered manuscripts of any faith tradition around the world to try to make sure copy. So it's kind of that milieu. But the other thing is really the work that my monastery, as many monasteries are doing right now, which is we're living in a time of impasse. What was isn't anymore. What will be has not quite emerged. When I first joined the monastery and I was being hauled off to Northwest, in the Northwest here, women religious have collaborated on everything for the last 150 years. We were never totally separate autonomous groups because there just aren't that many of us. And so I'm hauled off as a newbie being in training to a meeting, and the experts were saying, in 2 or 3 years, this is 1992, 3, 4, we'll know what religious life will look like. So just, hang in there for a couple of years. Here we are 30 years later. It's like, So we're living in a time of impasse, and society is living in a time of impasse. The fact that we're having these birthing pangs it's not the rise. We're finally, some of us, paying attention to the fact that racism is alive and well in the United States, and we have people using the Bible to justify racism and, the white Christian supremacists. And I hate the fact they get to use the word Christian. And I joke that we've got to start setting higher standards for who's allowed into the Catholic Church, because over the decades, we've allowed certain people in who have absolutely no sense of the social justice teaching of the church and dare to dictate to bishops what the actual teaching of the church is. And it's like, oh my God. But, there's so much upheaval. What is it? 60, 70 million people are on the run because of environmental devastation or wars or corporate destruction or whatever the whatever is. We're in it, the birth pangs of what's going on. And we're in this time of impasse. We can't control, force, change, or move anything. What my monastery is doing, like so many other groups, is we're taking the baby steps as we sense how God is calling us into the future, but we're just listening with great intensity about what is our call. If we're going to continue to exist, are we going to need to close down? We're seeing a lot of religious communities in this country shutting down. They talk about concluding in place or having completed their mission or purpose and using different language like that. And really one of the hot topics right now out there is, oh my God, where are all the women's archives going? Because people are now realizing we hold a lot of history. And if communities are shutting down, where is it all going? Young scholars are very concerned. And so listservs right now are about, oh my God, where is it all going? How do we find it? How do we document where it's all going? Because we do hold a lot more than just our own history. But my community is sitting in an intense stance of listening in terms of what is our future and how do we be present to ourselves, one another, the divine, our public, in the midst of not knowing what the future is. And that tends to take a lot of time. That takes a lot of energy in terms of trying to be present to the Holy Spirit until we know, what's going to be the next step, the next phase.
Amen. Well, thank you for sharing that.
And oblates are booming, so that may be the new expression of Benedictine life, but just don't know.
Yes. I am sitting with great curiosity about how the Spirit is moving amongst all these transitions. And like you said, this time of impasse and sitting in that unknowing without trying to direct which way the wind will blow, but also being hopefully a loving support in that. I'm so grateful for your work, Sister Laura.
Thank
for how you showed up in this conversation. And I always like to close a conversation by asking the guest, if you're going to pair our conversation with a drink, what would be your drink of choice?
Our conversation with a drink?
Yeah. So don't get too highfalutin that this moves beyond just a theoretical. This is concrete. If someone's going to press play and listen to us talk about the Beguines, what drink do you think would best go with that?
I guess it should be a decent Irish whiskey.
A decent Irish whiskey.
Yeah, none of the cheap stuff. I don't even drink much, but I am pretty seriously Irish, and so yes.
There you go. Is there a particular brand that you favor, or is it just a high-end Irish whiskey?
No, just an authentic one. I don't know.
Authentic.
Yeah.
All right. I love that. Thank you, Sister Laura. Deeply appreciate that. Thank you for listening to this episode of Contemplify. May it stir conversation with kindred spirits and strangers alike, and provide a nourishing morsel of thought for your week. Slip over to contemplify.com to find the show notes for this episode. While you're there, sign up for the monthly Contemplify non-required reading list and the weekly contemplative practice, Lo-Fi and Hushed. If you're enjoying Contemplify, rate and review it on your podcast player. The president of the internet slipped me a note just the other day on a napkin that said, "This will help spread the contemplative cheer." The theme song of Contemplify is called Langside by Charles Enns and Darren Hovius. Fellas, grateful as always. And I'm looking forward to bringing you more musings and conversations with contemplatives in the world here in the near future. Until then, be well.